Hello and welcome to the SnapIt podcast. I am your host, Nehemiah, and I am the director of recruiting over at SnapIt. Today we have a great show for you. We are speaking to Carlo Santos. Carlo is the Ruby on Rails instructor over at SnapIt. Today we cover many topics like what Ruby on Rails is, all the way to the duties you may perform. He gives some great information for those of you who are interested in taking the Ruby on Rails course. Hope you enjoy this episode just as much as we enjoyed making it.
The SnapIt Solutions Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Carlo.
Yeah, no problem. Glad to be here.
So, Carlo, one of the biggest questions that I get is, what is Ruby on Rails?
Okay, so this is kind of a two-part answer. Ruby on Rails is a framework built on the Ruby language. So just like any other language like Java, JavaScript, Ruby is kind of a general purpose scripting language, and it was popularized by Rails. Rails is the framework that allows developers to generate web applications really quickly with the Ruby language.
What would you say is the biggest difference between Ruby on Rails and JavaScript?
So the main difference between Ruby on Rails and JavaScript would be the syntax. They both generally do the same things. You can use them for general scripting, general web applications, right? But the big difference is that Rails uses the Ruby language, which is a little cleaner, a little easier for beginners to get started with because Ruby doesn't have all those semicolons, all those curly braces that make it a little harder for a language like JavaScript or Java to understand.
Do you need any experience to get started?
So to get started on the course, no, you don't need any programming experience. Basic computer literacy would be helpful, knowing how to navigate through your computer, knowing how to open files in certain directories. But other than that, yeah, no prior programming experience needed.
And would you be able to touch a little bit on what the class covers?
So the class covers everything from basic industry tools that are industry standards like Git, version control tools. We'll use GitHub to actually maintain our projects and push it to a repository so we can share our code and collaborate together. We will learn things like the software development lifecycle, what is included in that from designing to deployment. We'll learn about programming and the basic concepts that translate throughout whatever language that you choose. So you don't have to just want to do Ruby on Rails. This will translate if you want to get into JavaScript, if you want to get into Java. So yep, basic web development, focusing on soft skills and 8 weeks of actual technical training.
Is there a certification for Ruby on Rails?
There are certifications for languages like Java. You have the Oracle certification. Ruby on Rails does have a certification. I'm not entirely sure that it is as notarized as the Oracle certification, but it never hurts. But the cool thing about web development is if you can show off your portfolio, if you can show it to your employers, that's a good way to sell yourself. So you don't necessarily need a certification. You can get one. And the time that it takes to get that certification definitely depends on your learning speed. But I would say you don't need a certification. What you need to be able to do is show off what you know in some way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is this a growing career field, would you say?
Definitely. I'd say anything in tech is a growing field. So if you can get your foot in the door, it doesn't really matter how you get it in. If you want to be a programmer, just pick whatever language that will get you a job. And there are plenty of Ruby on Rails jobs here in the greater Kansas City area. So, yep, don't worry about a shortage of jobs. They are out there. Just acquire the skills.
And we'll definitely touch on that a little bit later as far as, what the demand is like. What would you say are some of the job duties for someone who studied Ruby on Rails?
some of the job duties. So if you're working with a client, you're probably going to be working with existing code, right? So you're not necessarily developing something from scratch. So you have to be able to look inside of other developers' code, be able to read their logic, implement new features and whatnot, meet deadlines. So it really is a deadline oriented kind of job.
Now, obviously, one of the biggest questions that we get is what is the average national salary for someone who has studied this?
Yeah, sure. So the average national salary, just looking at Glassdoor, it's about 90,000 is the average salary for a Ruby developer. For a junior Ruby developer, the national average is 64K.
Is there an internship involved with this after you graduate?
But yeah, there is an apprenticeship opportunity for anyone that performs really well in the course, for sure.
Now, you talked about it a little bit earlier. Could you tell us what the demand is like here in Kansas City for this position?
The demand, I know there's a very large bioinformatics company that are always looking for Ruby developers. I know that they use it. Um, our company has a large supply of Ruby on Rails developers. Um, and the thing is, you can always get remote work. There's a lot of West Coast jobs with Ruby on Rails developers. So even if you can't find it in the metro, in the greater Kansas City area, you can get connected with remote jobs if you get into the tech field. But for sure, there's definitely a demand here in the Kansas City area.
Now, for those jobs, you did touch on one company. What do you say these companies will really be looking for to hire for this position?
Most companies are looking for someone that is a self-learner, someone that doesn't mind putting in some extra hours on the job because it is kind of deadline oriented. You do kind of have to be willing to put in extra hours when the grind is there, right? But it does also have flexibility at the same time. A lot of us are working remote right now.
Is there a job placement once you finish this course and then if you make it to the apprenticeship?
Right. If you do well in the apprenticeship, there is a position for full-time employment, depending on how successful the fit is with the company, right? We want you to be successful in the company as well as be successful for us.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Carlo, I want to thank you so much. That is the end of all of our questions. I think that you helped shed a lot of light on this subject, and I know a lot of the people who are interested in this course will be able to take a lot of this information and run with it. So I thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Awesome. Good luck to all you guys. Thank you, Nehemiah, for having me. Appreciate it.
The Snap IT Solutions Podcast.